Let's say you enjoy driving as much as I do, you're probably going to gravitate towards a conventional car like a sedan or a hatchback, which makes a lot of sense. But I can also appreciate that that doesn't work for everyone, especially those of you out there with families and room for only one vehicle in the driveway. That means crossovers, and if you're shopping in the premium space, there are plenty to pick from that are fast, fun, and functional. On the mainstream side, not so much. There is one option out there that should scratch the itch of something that's fun to drive, and that's the Mazda CX-5, though it does come at the cost of some of its overall functionality. Now, just to avoid any confusion, I do want to point out that this isn't a proper performance crossover like an AMG-tuned Mercedes GLC class or an Audi SQ5, but there are some of the basics baked into it, just like you would get in something like a BMW X3 before any M performance parts are even bolted on. So what does that mean? Well, if you're not interested in the cathartic principles of driving like I am, and you just need some basic family transportation to take the kids to school in the morning or to soccer practice, this will work perfectly fine. But there are some ways it doesn't work quite as well as the competition. But first, let's talk about some of the stuff that does work, like headroom. And it doesn't matter whether you're talking about the front seats or the back seats. It's some of the best in the segment. And I actually have more room up here than I do in the Honda CR-V or the Toyota RAV4. And that's great to see. And the other thing is outward visibility is great. And considering this isn't quite as tall and upright as those two entries or that redesigned Nissan Rogue I drove not too long ago, I am impressed with the views outside. I will say it is a little bit narrow in here and there isn't quite as much shoulder room as you get elsewhere, but I wouldn't necessarily call it uncomfortable. You just notice it with somebody sitting in this passenger seat. But now let's talk about some areas you will notice it come up short of others in the segment when it comes to practicality, and that's storage for your stuff. And the first one I want to talk about isn't exclusive to the CX-5, but it's still worth mentioning. It's the position of these cup holders. They're just pretty far back on this center console, so they're kind of awkward when you go to grab your coffee cup. And then the other thing is, if you take a look at that redesigned Rogue, well, it doesn't need traditional shift linkage. So there's a massive pass-through under the center console, and you get a big covered bin back here. And then if you look at that CR-V, well, the gear selector is actually on the dash, so the bin is even bigger. But up here, there's not so much to work with. This bin is kind of small, and then you get this cubby up here. That's it. And that also brings me to my next point. In some of the top trims in this thing, you do get wireless Apple CarPlay, but there's no wireless phone charger. And that's a bit like going to an all-you-can-eat buffet and being forced to eat off of a saucer instead of a dinner plate. It doesn't really make much sense to have one without the other, and this would be a perfect place to put a wireless phone charger. But because it doesn't have one, that means if you want to charge on the go, you have to have your phone plugged in, which kind of defeats the purpose. And if you don't have it plugged in, well, it actually drains your battery pretty quick. So that is a bit of a curious choice, and I'm not really sure why Mazda didn't put a wireless charger in here, especially because you do get one in the Mazda CX-9. So the fact that there isn't one in the CX-5 is a big disappointment. Now that also brings me to this infotainment system, and you do get a touchscreen in the Mazda CX-5, unlike the smaller Mazda CX-30, but it's disabled when you're driving as part of Mazda's approach to safety. Instead, you have to use the controller down here on the console, but I gotta be honest, I find it way more distracting than just tapping the touchscreen a couple times. And I do also want to take a minute to acknowledge the guy that got really upset after he watched my CX-30 review and asked me how can I call myself a car reviewer because he claims Android Auto and Apple CarPlay are hands-free systems. And he is right, but not completely right. So I do want to just talk about that for a quick second. Let's just say I want to navigate somewhere using my maps. Take me home.
Sorry, I can't do that because I can't find maps on your iPhone, but you can restore it from the App Store.
See, the problem is I don't use Apple Maps because it's terrible. I'm a Google Maps guy, but that means I can't use Siri's voice activation to tell it to take me places. Instead, I have to scroll over until I highlight this little microphone down here on the screen and use Google Maps embedded voice recognition system, which is a little bit frustrating that it adds these extra steps. And then if I want to zoom in or out on my map, I have to highlight this little arrow, click on that, and then zoom out or move around or whatever I want to do. Very annoying. And the same goes with my Apple Music. I like to listen to downloaded stuff, and that means I can't tell it to skip to the next artist. Just check it out. Play The Adolescents.
To do that, you'll need to either connect to Wi-Fi or enable streaming with cellular data in your Apple Music settings.
That stuff is in my library, but because it's downloaded, I can't tell it to play the stuff. And in fairness, some automakers disable your artist list when you're driving anyway, so it doesn't matter if you have a touchscreen. But the point here isn't that that guy was wrong and I'm right. It's that these systems are supposed to make life easier, but I just don't think Mazda's execution does that. Now, there are a couple other areas that the CX-5 might come up short of what you need, and the first one is cargo room. There's just not as much space back here as you get in the CR-V or the RAV4. And I'm not trying to paint a picture like this thing is going to be bad at hauling your stuff around, it's just that there are better options out there if that's a priority for you. And something else to point out, this liftover height is a couple inches taller than the CR-Vs, and that means it's going to take a little more effort to get heavy items in the back. Don't believe me? Well then check this out. It's like a station wagon, and that means you're not going to hurt your back when you have to heave something heavy into the back of the CR-V. See, I told you, and now is probably a good time to remind you that you can go back and watch the full review once you're done here, and you may as well click that subscribe button below. There's also some good news back here, and it starts with these quick release handles just inside the tailgate that make it super easy to fold down those back seats. Something else that I love that's way underutilized, not just in this segment, but in the industry as a whole, is 40-20-40 folding back seats. And that means you can stash longer stuff like snowboards down the middle and still have 4 full seats for people. Now that brings me to my last point about practicality in here. Yes, I have a good amount of headroom, but there's not much legroom to work with. And the driver's seat is in my seating position, but you can see I barely fit back here. But when you go back and watch that CR-V review, you'll see how much space I had in the back seat of that thing. And it's not just when there are adults sitting back here. This seating position means your driver's seat is going to be well within kicking range of a kid in a car seat. So consider this your official warning. Now, if you can live with those compromises, the CX-5 delivers a level of driving enjoyment that just doesn't exist anywhere else in this segment. And the last time I remember a crossover like this being this much fun to drive was the Subaru Forester XT. No, you can't get this thing with a manual transmission, but if you opt for this turbo engine, you are getting a lot of bang for your buck. If you put 93 octane in the tank, you're getting 250 horsepower and 320 pound-feet of torque. But even if you go with regular grade gas, you're still getting 227 horsepower and 310 pound-feet of torque, so not much sacrifice. The only way you're getting that kind of output in this segment is with the 2-liter turbo in the Ford Escape or a top-of-the-line Hyundai. But it's not just about the output the CX-5 makes, it's how it uses it. The steering is precise, it has great feel and feedback, the suspension is firm so it doesn't have too much body roll, and overall, this is genuinely a crossover I enjoy driving on a winding road. And that's not something you'd usually say about crossovers in this mainstream segment. I actually really enjoy driving this thing. The nice thing about this is it's just as comfortable as anything else in the segment, and it's just as easy to drive. But having that fun factor is just a nice little bonus, and it's a great way to put a smile on your face. And I still can't get over how lively it is when you get on the gas. If you want this turbo engine under the hood, you can go with this anniversary edition I'm driving, and it's $45.5 grand or so before tax, and comes with all kinds of great stuff, including this red, white, and black interior that I love. But I understand it might be a little much for you, and if that's the case, you can go with the signature trim that's about $1,500 less and includes all the stuff here, but skips out on the funky cabin. Now, those are the only two you can get that come with both all-wheel drive and the turbo engine standard. You can go with the GT trim that's $40 grand before tax, and that includes the naturally aspirated engine and all-wheel drive. If you want the turbo motor, you have to pay $2,000 more. but either way, there's all kinds of great features inside. You get a 10-speaker stereo, a head-up display, traffic sign recognition, heated and ventilated front seats, and heated rear seats. That is an awesome package for the price. And then there's a Kuro edition below that that's about 38 grand, and that gets you red leather, but it's a little bit more understated overall. And that gets you the naturally aspirated engine as well as all-wheel drive, but you can't get the turbo motor. And then there are a couple cheaper trims below that. And there's a lot of good stuff even in the base one. You get the touchscreen, Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, heated front seats. There is some good features, though I will point out that advanced safety features are pretty slim in that base trim, and that's something the competition does a lot better than Mazda does here. Because if you look at the CR-V and the RAV4, you get stuff like adaptive cruise control, automatic emergency braking, lane keep assist, lane departure warning, you name it, all included in the base model. But here, all you get is automatic emergency braking and blind spot monitoring. If you want the rest of the stuff, you're gonna have to pay up for a more expensive trim. To recap, I like how enjoyable the Mazda CX-5 is to drive, the powerful turbo engine that's offered, and the three-way folding back seats. I don't like that advanced driver aids aren't standard, the infotainment controller on the console, or that it doesn't have a wireless phone charger. That pricing makes the CX-5 competitive with something like the Honda CR-V that's a drag to drive but has a ton more room for people and their stuff. For someone like me, I'd probably lean towards the CX-5 and deal with those sacrifices for how much fun it is on a winding road. But even if you don't enjoy driving like I do, this thing is just objectively way nicer from behind the wheel than anything else in the segment. I know that might not lead your list of reasons to buy a crossover in the first place, but it is a distinction that makes the CX-5 stand out from the crowd. And it's also nice to know that a mainstream crossover can be fun to drive without giving up all its functionality.